Coming up, the NFL Combine is underway, and GM Joe Schoen is giving sound bites as the New York Football Giants and every team around the NFL dives deeper on the scouting process. We'll break down his comments, a key player that Big Blue may want to target early in the draft, and a rumor around the league that could provide the Giants with a little more strength in the secondary. Yes, my friends, it's OGP, the One Giant Podcast, right here on YouTube, live on a Thursday as the NFL Combine kicks off. I'm Adam Armbrecht, breaking down the Brooklyn Nets on the Locked On Nets podcast with Doug Norrie, and your New Jersey Devils with Danny McDonough on the Devils Puck Luck podcast. And over there is the Season Generational ticket holder, the healthy, wealthy, and wise Andrew Makowitz. How are we, sir? And Andy's going to come back in here in just a second once he gets himself sorted out. When he does, what we will be talking about is the obviously the Combine, Joe Schoen and his comments there when asked about Daniel Jones. We're going to talk about one Jalen Ramsey, who the LA Rams are being reported interested in trying to move on from. Could that be an option for Big Blue? Should that be an option for Big Blue? And then lastly, we're going to take a look at an Ojulari. Not Aziz, but his younger brother, BJ, who obviously is a player that the Giants are going to potentially be interested in. Where does he fall in the draft? Could that be a target? So a lot of speculative questions, Andy, but where we are going to kick things off is obviously discussing Joe Schoen, every single coach, GM, talking at the Combine, giving those sound bites. And when he was asked about Daniel Jones and where the contract stands, the first one was regarded as the conversations have been, quote, productive, while also suggesting that there is still a significant gap to bridge between the two sides. Schoen said, "You're starting to feel the time crunch a little bit. I wish we were a little bit closer on a deal than what we are right now. But again, there's still time. We're going to circle back up again today at some point and meet with his representatives." This is all care of, I'm pulling this off of Pro Football Talk over on NBCSports.com. Andy, initially, when you just say, hey, okay, they're a little bit further apart, there's still some work to do. There's been so much speculation around how much Daniel Jones wants, what the Giants are willing to pay, where is the middle ground on it? Do you take anything away from Joe Schoen's comments? I guess this one is the crux of it. We'll wait to see if Andy gets himself dialed back in here potentially, because I don't know if he can hear me or what exactly is happening with Andrew. So we will go ahead and try to get him back in here in a second. In the meantime, though, I'll give you my perspective. I find it really difficult from a New York Giants perspective to sit here and say, do we feel like the Giants are going to struggle to get this across the line? That article over on Pro Football Talk does go on to say, if I look inside this article a little bit deeper, it's the conversation around whether or not that $45 million number, the $40 million number, the $35 million number, the $32.5 million tag, are any of those things concrete numbers that we should think about as being the gap when we talk about where the franchise is versus where Daniel Jones is, right? So there can be a lot of concerns when we talk about the state of these negotiations. Something that Andy was mentioning before we got going live here, though, was also the idea that this is a team, as I make a slight adjustment here, because I feel like I'm right a little low here over on YouTube. One of the things that I think we have to just accept is that GMs, head coaches, players, representatives, everything needs to be taken with somewhat a grain of salt, because we don't know what's been going on really behind closed doors. The mention of the time crunch. Yes, we understand coming up on the 7th, that tag day is available there for the Giants when it comes to Jones. They could use it and continue to work towards a result when it comes to the contract. They obviously also are concerned about looking at Saquon Barkley and what they intend to do with him. So all of these things are certainly in the air. My question really becomes, are the New York Football Giants locked into Daniel Jones, but are now just talking about the money. And I know we've heard Joe Schoen say, right? He's had the slip of the tongue where it's, oh, Daniel will be under center for us this upcoming season. Okay. And we agree, we believe that that is most likely the outcome here. But at some point, you have to take stock and say, well, when do we get this across the line? And if one side was starting at 33, 34 million, and the other side was starting at 40, 42 million, what is it going to take to get that gap to close? And then ultimately, as we know, if the franchise tag gets applied, how does that alter the way the Giants approach this offseason, the combine, the draft, free agency? So getting this ironed out in some way, shape, or form is really important for the New York Football Giants. We will continue to look at that and have the discussion around it as more information becomes available. But there are obviously timelines here that matter when we discuss this. Andy, I ran down all the fine bullet points about it, but are you comfortable with just letting this play out when it comes to Daniel Jones, Joe Schoen, the New York Giants? It's all going to get sorted. It's just a matter of when, not if.
I think my issue, Adam, is more around the prioritization of what the Giants are doing. They're basically saying, we're okay with Daniel Jones because we have both options, whether it's a long-term deal or the tag. The issue that you have is if you end up using the tag on Daniel Jones, that limits the options that you have with someone like Saquon Barkley. So obviously the Giants want to get it done. It's tough. At the beginning, you see Joe Schoen very excited, saying, cautiously optimistic, he's going to be back. And then as we get closer, he's like, I wish we were a little closer than what I thought we were. And I think he's kind of putting a little bit of urgency on Daniel Jones's agents and everyone else to say, like, we are running out of time. If we're going to find some middle ground, we need you guys to start showing your cards a little bit more. But Adam, we talked about this a little bit, pre-show. It's like Joe Schoen can't really win anything the more he talks to people like Peter Schrager or others at the combine, because you don't want to tip your cat hand or give away trade secrets or like whatever you're going to be doing. So does it really matter what Joe Schoen says? It's almost like, just say you want the player back, say you're working through negotiations, and like just get the deal done behind closed doors.
My apologies, ladies and gentlemen.
There we
Those
go.
are some really good thoughts that you didn't hear. I had some really fantastic ideas that I wanted to share with everybody.
We're having some computer issues, and so I thought it was my computer, and it just turns out it was user error by muting it. It's it makes me feel good. At least
We're having a lot of fun. So to tie a bow on the Daniel Jones thing, I think to your point, there's a world where Daniel Jones says, okay, 32.5 million on the tag. Like, it's not my ideal version, but guess what? If I go out and have another solid season for this team, the cap goes up, other QB contracts start to get signed. Remember, the Giants didn't pick up the 5th-year option, which at the time was the right decision. You can't be retroactive about the performance we saw and how you feel about it now. But another year from now, Daniel Jones can come right back to the table and say, well, now it is 45 to 50 million, because that's where the market says my value is. So we'll see how this unfolds here around the combine and whether or not anything concrete comes of it before the 7th and obviously the tag opening up.
I have one question just about negotiations in sports in general, Adam. Like, don't you think that the goal at this point, and we've seen it time and time again, should be for these players just to like negotiate, grab as much guaranteed money as humanly possible? Because like you can always say, I want a new deal, or I'm going to hold out, or I want a contract, or I want to do something. Like, it would not be optimal for Daniel Jones to take the $32 million franchise tag if he can guarantee himself $90 million or something like that. At least, why wouldn't you just take the bird in the hand, take the guaranteed money? And it's like, if in 12 months your play improves, go back to the table and say, guess what? I'm not playing under this old contract. Give me a new one. Right?
Yeah, I agree with you in the sense of $90 million is a ton of money. So, hey, what are we balking at? But that's also, it's all relative to market value, right? That's like saying you go into your day job and you go, listen, just give me the flat rate contract here. I'm not worried about bonuses at the end of the year or whatever the case may be, because I just want to be financially secure in this moment. Like, yes, and from a Giants perspective, you might say, "Oh, great, you're taking the guaranteed money, fantastic." But look at what's going on with Lamar Jackson in Baltimore. All of a sudden, negotiations start to break down around big dollars, and you get left in an off season, like the Giants kind of are, at least to a very small level right now, going, "Do we have our quarterback, or are we in a little bit of no man's land?" So we'll keep an eye on that as we move forward. The other things that we want to touch on here, obviously, as we talk about the combine kicking off this weekend. Today kicks off. Defensive linemen are going to go. I'm going to try to get back in live on YouTube, just have some takeaways. I got a few names that I want to throw out there from an overall college prospect list that we'll get into here as well. But one of the other rumors circulating is about an NFL player, and that is one Jalen Ramsey, and the fact that you mentioned this actually last episode. Now, all of a sudden, after going for it, you won the championship. That's all great. But now you're wondering if you're going to be able to be successful in the short term. How do you shed a lot of money so you can get back underneath cap numbers and ultimately rebuild? Like, you still want to be a high-level competitive team in the short and long term. Ramsey, who signed a 5-year, $105 million extension in 2022, he has 3 years left on his contract with a base salary of $17 million this year. 28 years old, rumored that the Giants could potentially be one of the suitors or landing spots for him. At a high level, would an idea like this, would a move like this say to you, "Oh, the Giants have, we think we're doing something this year"? Or is Jalen Ramsey more of a name than he is a commodity at this point? Is there a risk when you talk about having 3 years left on that extension?
Oh, I mean, Jalen Ramsey, there's no getting around the fact that he is a tremendous talent. I still think that he's the top 3 or 4 cornerback in the league. He is in his prime. Like, 28 years old is exactly where you expect his prime to be. How long he stays in that pocket is a good question. Does he have another 2, 3, 4 good, solid top 5 potential cornerback years left in his bag? Sure, I think he does. I think the issue for the Giants is making a move for someone like Jalen Ramsey, where you're giving up draft capital and signing an expensive veteran, means that Joe Schoen thinks they are ready to compete this upcoming season. Like, to me, that would mark that the Giants are pushing their chips in the center of the table and saying, we are looking to build on the playoffs, and we expect to not only just win a playoff game, but have a chance to win a championship. Like, this isn't a move that a team that's like, we're rebuilding necessarily would make, right?
Yeah, it depends on, I think, the price point when it comes to the capital, right? If you're talking about first round draft capital for Jalen Ramsey, which would be very justifiable, then that is a significant move. But if you think about it from the standpoint, while the price on the first and second, the next 3 years for Jalen Ramsey would be high. Let's say, when I did the first mock draft iteration for OGP last week, I ended up looking at Banks in the first round and a high cornerback prospect. So while the number would be higher, this ties back to Daniel Jones. Well, if I get him on the extension and I put his cap hit around 20 million for this upcoming season, and then I go ahead and bring in 17 million for Ramsey, that's 37 million combined. And I've given myself a great corner to tandem up with Aziz. I was going to say Aziz Adoree. 2 E's at the end of both those names, though. Adoree Jackson, right? So, and it's 3 years. It means that I've significantly improved my team in the short term. And I can know that 2 years from now, and I have to look at the contract specifics when it comes to Ramsey. I'm sure there's an out there, as every single NFL contract has. So if you go 2 years with him and then reboot it, or you don't extend Adoree Jackson, and now you have Ramsey for the extra season beyond Jackson's contract, right? So like, it comes down to what you're giving up. And if the Giants, and I said this before, look at the 25th overall pick and find this weird kind of murky middle ground where they're missing out on the wide receivers, and they're not going to take a tight end because that would be objectively insane, and the offensive lineman group isn't quite there yet, that's where I think, hey, maybe we get a little bit of value in a move like this. If you told me to put a percentage on it, I'm not going to sit here and say, "Hi, how are you?" We're talking about this being higher than 60, but I do think that it is something that at least speculatively can be discussed at this point, because we know the Giants have so many holes. It still comes down to Daniel Jones' contract, Saquon Barkley, and, as we mentioned before, Leonard Williams, right? There's a lot of names and a lot of money still on this roster to sort out.
If you were to ask me percentage odds of something like this happening, I would say it's almost close to 0%, Adam. And the
If it's
reason
more than
why,
0, though, it means it's possible.
like you said, anything is possible. But I think based on who our GM is in Joe Shane, he is a guy that enjoys the grind and the
Of
hustle
course.
of being able to find the diamonds in the rough in college. He's the guy that flies all over the place. He was known, throughout the business as a guy that would hop on a flight and go see any player anytime, any moment, and do talent evaluation that way. I don't see him giving up a premium asset where he can really put a stamp on something in order to go pay for a high priced older veteran type leader when he could be like, let me flex my acumen and my draft muscle to be able to do it.
And so two things here to note. One, well, maybe it's three. Joe Shane is a scout guy. Like that's where he made his bread and butter as an assistant GM and a scout before that. So I agree with you there. Two, you provided that information on the back side here about the contract for Ramsey. The out does come up after this season, 4 years into the contract. The cap hit would be 25 million, base to 7. You have the bonus, a signing bonus of 5 million, a restructure 3.2, whatever. So it ends up being 25.2 million, but you could come out of it after this one season, which maybe would relate back to what's the draft capital you're asking for. And the final thing I'll note is Jalen Ramsey, you mentioned leader. There's a margin there. And when it comes to leader, I don't know if he fits the mold. And this isn't a knock on Jalen Ramsey. This is like universal truth about athletes across all sports, no matter what position they play, no matter who they are. They sometimes, I've been watching the Nets. This is such a different degree. Spencer Dinwiddie's back in Brooklyn, and we all got reminded, God, this guy loves to complain. After every single play, he wants to chat it up with the refs. He feels like it's a foul every single time. In the recent years, some instances, we have seen Jalen Ramsey where maybe it is long corner, a lot of size, a lot of strength, but if he loses that half a step, right, there's so many cornerbacks really fall off a cliff in a big way. Do I think it's coming this year? No. But do I think it's possible over the life of this contract? Certainly.
86.4 Pro Football Focus grade for Jalen Ramsey, so he still was great. He would instantly be the Giants' number one cornerback, and Adoree would slot into a number two. From a fit perspective, what a dream it would be for Wink Martindale to get someone like Jalen Ramsey. Big body, physical, can handle one-on-one matchups on the outside so that you can create those exotic blitzes. Like, I'm talking myself into it the more I talk, because maybe that's not Joe Shane's bag, but maybe Wink Martindale's like, hey, while you're spending all this money on the offense with, Daniel Jones and Saquon Barkley, and you're thinking about drafting a wide receiver early, how about you get me some help on the defensive side of the ball? And how about you get me a cornerback, which is like the key instrumental piece that he probably needs to solidify the defense.
And that's what makes it fascinating, right? Because we know, and we're now going to turn our attention to this draft and the combine and all the holes the Giants have to fill. There is some balancing act here. And we've discussed and looked out there. We know that there's a man up in Buffalo who may not official, but may not be tagged and may not remain there. And that's a linebacker option. Okay, great. But what if not that, right? You mentioned that the money isn't being spent there. Money is being spent on the outside at times because that's a big needle mover. So we'll monitor this. I thought it's worth bringing up for the simple fact that if you are at any level willing to go and pursue a trade for a player like Jalen Ramsey, then that means maybe if you get the contract sorted out with Jones and you see where the cap stands, that at least means that you're willing to look at the market as well and maybe improve that position in free agency. And maybe that's the one big splash that this team makes and frees up their options when it comes to the draft, which when we turn attention to the draft, Andrew, there's a guy out there. You may have heard of his brother. His name's Aziz. His last name's Ojulari. His younger brother, BJ, played together. And there's been some speculation that BJ would love to reunite with his brother at the NFL level. The problem probably that we're talking about when it comes to BJ, and I want to ask you kind of a two-pronged question with it. The first problem is where he lands in the draft and whether or not he'll even be available for the Giants to potentially take, right? Because he's in that first round kind of range. The combine is going to prove critical for how he looks and what the expectations would be there. And then, Joe Shane didn't draft Aziz. We know how electric he's been shown capable of being. But is there any you think in the back of their mind kind of going, well, family history says there's some injury concerns here, even if they're mild, even if they're little nagging ones, even if they're unrelated, right? Fluky, doesn't matter. There's some injury concerns here. Can we afford to double down on two Ojularis and then maybe find ourselves without two Ojularis in the season?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting thought. The thing that separates BJ from Aziz is that BJ's played in almost all of his games in college. It doesn't seem like he has the same injury type history. He played 11 games in 2022. He played 13 games in 2021. Obviously, he is electric. Most places have him ranked as the second best defensive end. They're kind of saying he could be a top 10 pick potentially because edge rusher is so important. It just would we love to if he was available at 25? If you're asking me if I would want BJ Ojulari, the answer is yes. My
Right.
my second thing is, but with that 25th pick, there is also so many other areas of need for the Giants. You would hope that Aziz Ojulari and Kayvon Thibodeau, who you spent a top 5 pick on last season, are enough at the edge rushing position where you can focus on other areas of need. So BJ, great player, probably going to go top 10, if not top 15. Giants have so many other areas of need, but I get it. The brother story is nice, and hey, he would look good in blue.
That's all you really want. I want the feel good story, right? I want
Right.
every brother of any player that the Giants have to be drafted, so I can just say, "Oh my God, we have literally cut this thing in half. The family reunion gets so much more condensed, plenty more food to go around when you don't have to send out those double invitations." So it'll be interesting. And the point about where his stock is, like I started to think about whether or not the Giants might be willing to make a marginal move from 25 up towards 20 if the right player is falling there. Use one of the two. They have the conditional third from Kansas City. Be willing to kind of go and attack a player of need. But I just BJ is going to be too far outside the range for the Giants. It would be a seismic move to go do that. And at that point, as good as he is, and as much as I like him as a prospect, to your point, got a lot of needs at a lot of different areas. Edge rusher should actually be at least marginally down the list by a few positions, and it makes it hard for them to commit to where they would have to go get him. The other thing then for me is when we think about this combine and getting some clarity, the defensive line for the combine will get there today. We'll see some things over on Substack. I've highlighted a couple wide receivers. I just highlighted DeMarvion Overshown from Texas, who's a long, lean linebacker. There's a lot of names that I want to kind of just throw out here, but how much do you think it factors in when we look at this roster and a guy like Darian Beavers, who arguably fell to the 6th round? I had said I would have taken him as high as the back end of the 4th potentially. So, but he gets injured. He might be the only guy that you look at inside that linebacking core. Do you think it's difficult for Joe Schoen to sit here today and say, well, maybe I have one. We think we have one, but he's still a 6th round pick, whether or not it was a steal or otherwise. We have so many needs inside that linebacking core. I wonder how they build this board and whether or not some of these guys, like an Overshown, who I earmarked, if he's at 100, I love him. At 89, I'm willing to take him because he doesn't make it there in a lot of mocks. It's like some ways you think if you really like the prospect, maybe he looks okay. Like maybe these guys don't overperform at the combine because the Giants are going to be in that real finite area, especially from 25, 57, and 89. They have massive needs and they can't afford to miss the boat on a couple of key positions that have big gaps in terms of prospect talent when we look at the overall NFL board.
Well, it's also interesting if Joe Schoen will go in with the best player available mentality, which I know that they've talked about before, because obviously if an edge rusher falls to them and he's the best player on the board, do you turn to Wink Martindale and say, do you want another edge rusher? Or, Trenton Simpson, the linebacker from Clemson, is sitting there. It is an area that we really need someone. And Wink might say, well, edge rushers and cornerbacks are actually most important in my defense, so I prefer them. Like, I'm curious how Joe Schoen will address that with Wink Martindale. Like, do we just take the best player available and then Wink, you have to fit it in? Or does he look and Wink says, I desperately need a cornerback more than anything else. Like, please help me out in the first round or two.
Yeah, and that's where scheme versatility. And that's what I liked about Overshown, by the way, as an example, because he's a guy that has, if you compare him, let's compare him to Beavers just from a prospect standpoint. He has that little extra bit of burst to be full sideline to sideline linebacker. He's shown in college, can range all the way back into the secondary, defend against passes downfield. Now he's a little bit leaner, 220, 6'4", has to put some meat on his bones. So there's deficiencies in his game, but they've even speculated, hey, there'll be times when you could even flex him out into the slot in a zone look because he's that athletic and that skilled. So if there's that much versatility, well, then I feel like, and we're talking about 3rd round, okay, earmark him. A lot of versatility. So now at 57 and up to 25, it is about filling the exact need. And to your point about best player available, this would probably tie back into a lot of fans saying, hey, tight end, because guess what? The tight end might be the best player available at 25. And that's where you have to go, yeah, well, what we said was best player available within the top 3 needs that we have on our board right now. So I think they have to balance that in a lot of ways. I don't know, like 57, when I've looked at that, when you go in, I've talked about this with offensive linemen, and I'll go to the old stat sheet here, because I was looking at Tipman at 57 potentially. There's also Schwartz, who's just above him there, that doesn't always fall to that point. But then after that, you're talking about a lot of, first of all, tackles to start, and then beyond that, like Kirkland, who I looked at, a guard, like these are guys that fall further back down the list. The interior offensive line specifically is a little bit barren. If you don't get it by 57, you could be waiting until 128. And while you can find a nice prospect you like at 128, you can't guarantee that you're going to plug in a starter. So, this best player available mentality, I have to go back to it and say, yes, but on the interior of the offensive line, we may look at all 3 positions and say, we need a starter. Like, we'd like to have someone competing to start there. So it's hard for me to say the first 4 picks are off the board and you haven't gotten an offensive lineman. It's hard for me to say first 4 picks off the board and you haven't gotten a linebacker or maybe 2, right? Like, so at some point you have to acknowledge where the needs are, as long as the talent is reasonable that you can get.
Well, I keep going back to this, Adam, and it's something that I have stuck in my mind after I thought about it. Is in that first round, you talk about having the 50-year option available. I
Yeah.
also just think about, what is the premium position that if you whiff on, you have to pay big money in free agency in order to fix the problem. To me, wide receiver is one of them, and cornerback is another one. Doesn't it feel like you can kind of get a rotational, even a starting middle linebacker that is productive for less in free agency than what even a number 2 cornerback would cost in free agency? Like,
Yes.
to me, I'm thinking about, if Joe Schoen is thinking about where allocation is, does that mean that you would spend money for an inside linebacker in round 1, knowing that you do need another cornerback desperately, knowing that you do need a wide receiver desperately? Like, if you're starting to think about moving away from best player available and just thinking like best player for what our team needs, then I think that's an interesting little situation for Joe Schoen.
Yeah, and then so I'll take that even a step further, because you mentioned about like inside linebacker, cornerback, big needs, and that 5th-year option. Linebacker is, to your point about plug and play. So along with Overshown, one of the other guys is Herberg, who's edge linebacker. He does a nice job in coverage. Other names that I've been looking at and like could be a player like Dorian Williams, who's falling probably even beyond the 128 selection for the Giants. So maybe some value there. I also like Greenhagen, who's way down the list. I'm marking him like 241. He's a run stuffer. Like, he's a one-trick pony. But guess what? I can kind of build out that group with a skill set that I can rotate through and utilize. You cannot rotate through wide receivers anymore if you're the Giants, right? You can't piecemeal this thing together. The unfortunate thing at 25, when we talk about wide receiver, and the combine will flesh a lot of this out, is like, are any of them going to be there? Or right now, it's like Dell is one of the guys. It's like, is he the guy that's just, he's not really a first round value, but the Giants don't pick until 57. So if you see him, you like him, you want him, and he's electric. He's also 160 pounds soaking wet. Like, there's so many problems just inside of that, and it makes it really tricky for me. So I'll just close out with this thought. I want to get your take on it, because over the course of this weekend, there's so many players that I've listed out here. I mentioned some of, and Simpson, by the way, is on there as well. A guy, and it's not, you were mentioning, I think, a different Simpson there at the top. There's another
Trenton Simpson is the linebacker who projected to probably go in the first round, but there are.
I've got a back end. I've got a back end linebacker named Simpson that we might take a look at too. Schoenmaker is the tight end out of Michigan that I'm really excited to look at. He probably is going to rise somewhere up the board. Maybe he's worth the 4th round pick there at 128. 162 would be ideal for him. I have a handful of tight ends that I think are viable moving in towards the back half of the draft. But if I told you right now that my hierarchy board from the first all the way to 162, right? In those 5 picks, I need to have 1, probably 2 linebackers. I need to have 1, and I'll reverse that. 1 linebacker, 1, maybe 2 linemen, I need a cornerback, and I need a wide receiver. And I can be flexible around maybe 2 wide receivers, and it's just 1 interior offensive lineman, and you get away with it for 1 more year because a starting center plug and play, hey, I'll live with what else we're developing there, right? We have some young players. We have a veteran at the right guard position. I can work with that. Do you agree with that hierarchy of board, knowing you're going to have, obviously, you want to add depth at edge rusher. We're going to need to add multiple wide receivers. We know that. Tight end's a need, but it's not something that I can earmark that high up the board. Do you feel comfortable with that?
Yes. I think the difficult balance that we have is that we just don't know what they're planning to do in free agency to complement whatever you walk away with. So without knowing, for me, I just keep going, what positions can we not have to spend premium draft capital, address for a middle number in free agency and be fine? I think a tight end, it's like, could you get a 30-year-old tight end to bring a veteran into the locker room to
Sure.
work with Bellinger for a couple $1 million? If the answer is yes to that, why would you spend a first or a second round pick on a tight end? To me, that doesn't seem to make sense. So the way that you're setting it up, it seems to align to what I'm thinking. Depending on what we do with Julian Love, depending how they feel
Sure.
about Dane Belton, like there is some secondary, maybe the safety position has to get addressed again by the Giants. So
Mhm.
maybe that gets put in there depending on how they feel about Julian Love. But yes, I think that a linebacker has to be a focus, a cornerback has to be a focus, and an offensive lineman. If you walk away with those three things, obviously a wide receiver, I think is going to be addressed either via trade or free agency or something else. If you can walk away and address those three things in the first 4 rounds, maybe 5 rounds, I think you'd be pretty happy.
Yeah, up to 1. And by the way, even if you think about 4 picks up to 100 there, it's actually 6 picks all the way to 162. But those first 4 up to 100, this is where if you go and look at the mock draft, the first one that I did, and I'm doing these write-ups, someone threw out the name like Rashee Rice, who I really love as a wide receiver, but never quite makes it to 57. So then it's like, that's where the hierarchy shifts too. It's like, yeah, there wasn't a wide receiver at 25. We have a couple of guys we like. Whoops, we didn't get them there. Now all of a sudden the pressure at 89, at 100, and then what it takes off your board in terms of other needs. And to your point, if the Giants were to go out and sign a linebacker in free agency, that was their one big splash, I'd say I still want to add another linebacker, but 100, even 128, right? 162. We can move that back. The cornerback one is fascinating to me. If you sign somebody great, I don't think they're going to go that route. But then obviously your first round becomes completely different because you're taking that off the board. There's not necessarily a linebacker at this moment that falls in there. There's not an offensive lineman at this moment that falls in there. So this is where I think we talked about this last year even too. The options that you want to have. If Joe Schoen could have had the options to trade back one of those 2 top 10 picks, he would have loved to fill up the draft capital a little bit more. I'm sure at 25, he wouldn't hate. Hey, someone from 30, stay in the first round, 31, really likes a player that adds to their championship caliber roster. Great, come get it. We'll take the extra pick this year or next year if he gets stuck there. That's where I think it's really fascinating. Again, assuming that the board falls a little bit funky. But that's the beauty of this combine weekend here, because you're going to see a lot of guys confirm or deny where their stock should be placed. And my favorite part about this, Andy, if I could say at the end of the day, is that when we think about the way this combine unfolds, what I love about it is that you can have guys that played at smaller schools. But then when you see them side by side with the guys out of Ohio State and some of the biggest programs in Alabama, and you all of a sudden go, oh, that's not, they don't look as far apart on tape as you might suspect. It's hard to get over who they play against, the competition level, etc. But sometimes the combine can be a great equalizer in terms of what you think a player can develop into. It's not about necessarily the baseline and how high they'll come in as a floor at the NFL level, but you can see athleticism, right? You can see some intangible pieces that go, we can build that, we can mold that. And that's what I find so fascinating about watching all these players all weekend long.
Yeah, you're going to be able to see that. I think that's a good point. Is like some of these guys from the smaller schools are there, Adam. You don't know how they stack up against the big name, big household, big bodies from schools like Georgia, LSU, Alabama, etc.
Yeah.
This is where you can really find that stuff. And Adam, I'm going to give you one little wrinkle.
Here
We
we go.
talk about offensive line. I think
Wrinkle me, buddy.
what we'll also talk about is I have for a while felt like center is not a premium position that you really need to do much with, that you can kind of interchange people in and out, and it's not worth a premium draft capital.
Sure.
And then a funny thing happened on Daniel Jones getting pressured up the middle, like, at will when someone like Feliciano was there. And you look at how quickly the Chiefs were able to fix their offensive line, drafting Creed Humphrey in the second round and completely shoring things up for Mahomes. It makes me think maybe the Giants should be looking at the center position much earlier in the draft than maybe I would normally have thought.
Yep. You want to pair a guy with your quarterback, chemistry, continuity, consistency. Remember, the center anchors that offensive line in terms of relaying, communicating what everyone else needs to do as some of those adjustments get made by the signal caller, and let alone just protecting the quarterback. That's also a great thing to start off with. And it's the thing that I pushed back when I saw some people saying, hey, well, Nick Gates. I'm like, it's great. It's a wonderful story. There's no guarantee what he's going to be when, next season or beyond that. You need to get some real concrete consistency at that position. So I really, really love the fact that Andy's come around to my way of thinking. Guys, you can get over on YouTube. Thank you to everybody that came in, by the way. I see Michael R in there. I see Devon in there. A couple of the people were chatting around as well, which is absolutely fantastic. Later this afternoon, 3 p.m., the Combine Defensive Lineman. I'm going to be trying to watch that in real time. Might do some live streaming and just make some notes about players, give you a little bit of like a rundown of how I'm processing my board there. I've mentioned this before over on Substack. Going to continue to put these out as the Combine informs where some of the stock goes. And then probably maybe a Friday night special, friends, a fresh mock draft board here as the Combine unfolds, which will include this new hierarchy that I think we really need to address certain positions at certain points in the draft so that you ensure you actually do raise the floor for this roster on YouTube, on podcast feeds, on Twitter at One Giant Podcast, at Andy Mack 214, at Adam Armbrecht. We appreciate it, man. This is fun. You can tell by the pace at which I'm speaking. This is one of my favorite times of non-in-season football, sessions that I really love to sink my teeth in on. So we appreciate it, man. Everyone coming in. We'll continue to rock and roll with this, man. And Andy, you can provide closing thoughts here because I'm laboring on, but we know what the fans demand, want, and need to know.
I mean, as always, Adam, let's go Big Blue.
Bang.